Have you noticed how much harder it has become to truly feel for others? I'm not talking about a lack of politeness or superficial courtesy. I'm referring to that profound capacity to genuinely put yourself in another person's shoes, to feel their pain as if it were your own, to understand their motivations even when they diverge completely from yours. If you've noticed that something has changed in how we relate to one another, if you feel that an invisible barrier has risen between you and the people around you, you're not imagining things. What you're experiencing is part of a silent but profound transformation that is redefining the very nature of human connection. This transformation is not merely a passing social phenomenon or an inevitable consequence of technological progress. It is a fundamental alteration in the architecture of our collective mind, and signs indicate it will reach a critical point in 2026. To understand why this is happening and what we can do about it, we first need to examine how we got here and why our natural capacity for empathy is being systematically eroded by forces we're only beginning to understand. Empathy, this almost magical capacity to emotionally resonate with other human beings, did not emerge by chance in our species. For millions of years of evolution, those human groups that developed greater empathetic capacity had decisive advantages for survival. Empathy enabled large-scale cooperation, collective care for the vulnerable, anticipation of group needs, and formation of lasting alliances. In the African savannas, where our species took its first steps, the ability to read emotions, anticipate behaviors, and respond appropriately to the emotional signals of other group members often meant the difference between life and death. A hunter who could perceive genuine fear in his companions could detect invisible dangers. A mother who felt deeply the suffering of the group's children, not just her own, contributed to the survival of the entire community. A leader who truly understood the needs and concerns of his people could make wiser decisions and maintain social cohesion. Empathy was not an emotional luxury or an abstract moral virtue. It was a survival technology refined by millennia of natural selection. For most of human history, we lived in small groups where we personally knew every member of our community. We saw the same faces every day, shared the same joys and sorrows, faced the same challenges. Our empathy evolved to function in this intimate and direct context. When someone was suffering, we immediately saw the signs, the curved posture, the distant gaze, the genuine tears. When someone experienced joy, their happiness was contagious and we could all participate in that experience. This constant physical and emotional proximity created a dense network of empathetic connections that strengthened the entire community. We didn't need to make conscious effort to feel empathy. It emerged naturally from the conditions in which we lived. Empathy was the social fabric that held our groups together, and the stronger this fabric, the greater the chance of collective survival. But something fundamental began to change when our societies grew beyond tribal scale. First came cities, then empires, then nation-states, and finally the digitally connected global village. With each expansion, we found ourselves surrounded by more and more strangers. People whose lives, experiences, and contexts were completely different from ours. Our empathetic mind, calibrated for groups of a few dozen close individuals, found itself overwhelmed by an impossible amount of information about the suffering and joy of millions or billions of people. It's as if we had taken a delicate musical instrument, tuned to play intimate melodies in a small room, and placed it to perform in a giant stadium. The instrument doesn't break immediately, but its music becomes lost, distorted, and gradually loses its ability to play the most subtle and profound notes. This empathetic overload intensified dramatically with the arrival of mass media. For the first time in human history, we began to be daily bombarded with images and stories of the suffering of people we would never meet, in places we would never visit, facing problems we could not solve. Our empathetic mind, which evolved to respond to the suffering of close group members with direct action and concrete care, found itself in an impossible position. How do you respond empathetically to the hunger of millions of children on the other side of the world? How do you emotionally process the hundreds of tragedies that reach you through television every day? The only psychologically sustainable response was to develop a kind of emotional anesthesia, a defense mechanism that protected us from the unbearable pain of feeling deeply for all those who suffer beyond our reach. Initially, we thought this anesthesia would be temporary and selective. We believed we could turn off our empathy for distant and abstract suffering, but keep it fully active for people close to us in our lives. But the human mind doesn't work with such surgical precision. Empathetic capacity is like an emotional muscle. The less we use it, the weaker it becomes. And when we began systematically protecting ourselves from the emotional impact of distant suffering, we also began, inadvertently, to weaken our capacity to feel deeply for the pain of people close to us. This is one of the most disturbing discoveries of recent research in social neuroscience. Empathy is not like a faucet we can turn on and off selectively. It's more like an emotional immune system that, when suppressed in one area, becomes compromised in all others. The arrival of the internet and social media accelerated this process in a way nobody fully anticipated. These technologies were created with the best intentions, connecting people, democratizing information, creating global communities of interest and mutual support. And in many aspects, they fulfilled these promises, but they also created a radically new environment for our empathetic mind, an environment for which we had no evolutionary preparation. Suddenly, we found ourselves exposed not only to the edited and filtered stories of distant suffering that arrived through traditional media, but to the constant and unfiltered flow of raw emotions from hundreds or thousands of acquaintances and strangers. Every time we open our digital platforms, we are confronted with a torrent of joys, anger, sadness, fears, and frustrations that would be impossible to process adequately, even if we dedicated our entire lives to this task alone. Worse still, we discovered that the very characteristics that make social media addictive also make the empathetic experience increasingly superficial and performative. The design of these platforms rewards quick and emotionally intense responses, not deep reflection or nuanced understanding. When someone shares a personal tragedy, the system encourages us to respond with a sad face emoji or a two-word comment, not with the kind of sustained attention and emotional care that true empathy requires. Gradually, we began confusing these automatic and superficial responses with genuine empathy. We began believing that liking a post about social injustice is equivalent to genuinely feeling for the pain of the victims, or that sharing an inspirational meme is the same as offering real emotional support to someone going through difficulties. This substitution of genuine empathy with digital simulacra has consequences that go far beyond what happens online. When we practice superficial and performative empathy most of our time, this degraded form of emotional connection begins to contaminate our offline relationships as well. We begin applying the same logic of quick response and fragmented attention to face-to-face encounters with family, friends, and colleagues. The ability to sit with someone in silence, to truly listen without formulating a response, to feel deeply without needing to immediately resolve or comment, all these fundamental empathetic skills begin to atrophy from lack of practice. We become increasingly impatient with the slowness and complexity of authentic emotional connection, preferring the instant gratification of superficial digital interactions. But what makes the situation particularly worrying is that this erosion of empathy is happening precisely when we need it most. We face global challenges that require unprecedented levels of cooperation and mutual understanding: climate change, growing inequality, geopolitical tensions, pandemics, disruptive technological transformations. All these problems can only be solved if we can transcend our tribal differences and work together based on genuine empathetic understanding of each other's needs and concerns. However, at the exact moment when empathetic cooperation becomes most crucial for our collective survival, we are systematically weakening our capacity to achieve it. The evidence for this erosion is becoming impossible to ignore. Longitudinal studies show consistent and significant declines in empathy measures among young adults over the past 2 decades. Neuroimaging research reveals that people who spend more time on digital platforms show less activation in brain regions associated with empathy when exposed to signals of others' suffering. Language analysis on social media demonstrates a progressive reduction in the use of words related to positive emotions and mutual support, and a corresponding increase in language expressing irritation, contempt, and dehumanization of outgroups. Perhaps most alarmingly, we're beginning to see evidence that this empathetic erosion is not limited to relationships with strangers, but is affecting the quality of intimate relationships as well. Rates of divorce, social anxiety, depression, and loneliness are reaching historic levels, even in societies with unprecedented material living standards. This brings me to the specific prediction about 2026. It's not an arbitrary date chosen to grab attention. It's when several converging trends should reach a critical inflection point. First, 2026 marks approximately a decade since the first fully digital native generation began entering adulthood and assuming leadership positions in their communities and organizations. This is the first generation in human history that grew up with unrestricted access to digital technologies from childhood, and we are only beginning to understand the neurological and social implications of having developing brains constantly exposed to the fragmented stimuli and intermittent rewards of digital platforms. Their empathetic capabilities were shaped in an environment radically different from anything our species has ever experienced, and by 2026, they will be old enough for us to clearly see how this different formation translates into real-world behaviors and decisions. Second, 2026 also represents the moment when artificial intelligence systems will begin becoming sophisticated enough to convincingly simulate empathetic human interactions. Chatbots and virtual assistants are already being programmed to recognize emotional signals and respond in ways that seem empathetic and understanding. For many people, especially those already struggling with authentic human connections, these artificial interactions may begin to seem more satisfying and less complicated than trying to navigate the emotional messiness of real human relationships. There is a real risk that as empathy simulations become more convincing and easily accessible, our motivation to develop and maintain genuine empathetic skills will continue to diminish. Third, 2026 coincides with projections about when various global crises may reach critical points requiring coordinated and empathetic responses on an unprecedented scale. If predictions about climate change are correct, we will see significant increases in forced migrations, resource scarcity, and climate-related conflicts. If current economic trends continue, inequality may reach levels that make social cohesion unsustainable. If political polarization continues deepening, we may see democratic breakdowns that require empathetic reconciliation to repair. In any of these scenarios, our collective capacity to respond with wisdom and compassion will be tested like never before, and it is precisely this capacity that is being systematically weakened. The cruel irony is that many of the technologies contributing to empathy erosion were originally marketed as tools to increase connection and understanding. Mark Zuckerberg spoke about making the world more connected and open. Twitter promised to democratize conversations and give voice to the voiceless. YouTube was supposed to allow ordinary people to share their stories and experiences. And in a sense, all these promises were fulfilled. We've never had access to so many different perspectives. It's never been easier to learn about lives and experiences completely different from ours. It's never been simpler to find communities of people who share our interests and concerns. But quantity of connection doesn't automatically translate into quality of connection, and exposure to different perspectives doesn't guarantee empathetic understanding of those perspectives. In fact, we discovered that the opposite is often true. Information overload can lead to what psychologists call compassion fatigue, a state where we become emotionally numb as a defense mechanism against excessive empathetic stimuli. The ease with which we can block, mute, or simply ignore perspectives that make us uncomfortable online has created a growing tendency toward not just informational filter bubbles, but empathetic ones as well. We surround ourselves with people who feel and think like us and gradually lose the ability to relate empathetically with those who see the world differently. Constant exposure to edited and curated versions of other people's lives on social media has also created an epidemic of social comparison that makes it difficult to feel genuine joy for others' achievements or genuine compassion for their failures. I want to stop for a moment to ask you something directly. When was the last time you really stopped to feel deeply for someone who was going through difficulties? I'm not talking about feeling pity or superficial sympathy. I'm asking about that moment when you genuinely allowed yourself to absorb the emotional weight of another person's suffering, when you felt their pain almost as if it were your own pain. If you're having trouble remembering such a moment recently, you're not alone. Many of us have discovered that our natural capacity for deep empathy has become increasingly rare and difficult to access. If this feeling resonates with you, share in the comments, I feel my empathy has diminished. When? Your comment might help other people realize they're not alone in this experience of emotional desensitization, and perhaps we can begin to understand together how to recover our natural capacity for deep connection, but recognizing the problem is only the first step. The more important question is, what can we do about it? How can we reverse, or at least mitigate, this trend of empathetic erosion before it causes irreversible damage to the social fabric that keeps us together as a species? The answer is not simple or quick, but it's also not impossible. It requires a combination of personal, social, and technological changes, all guided by a deeper understanding of how empathy really works and what it needs to flourish. The first thing we need to understand is that empathy, like any complex human capacity, requires deliberate practice and adequate conditions to develop. Just as we wouldn't expect to become physically fit without regular exercise, we can't expect to maintain our empathetic fitness without consistent training. This means deliberately creating opportunities to practice deep and sustained empathetic attention. It can be as simple as dedicating 15 minutes a day to really listening to someone close to you without distractions, without the phone nearby, without pressure to respond or solve. It might mean consciously choosing to spend less time consuming torrents of fragmented digital emotions and more time in face-to-face interactions that allow the gradual development of mutual understanding. We also need to relearn the art of sustained attention, a skill that is fundamental to genuine empathy, but is being systematically eroded by technologies designed to capture and fragment our attention. Deep empathy requires the ability to stay present with another person through their complex and contradictory emotions, to resist the impulse to judge quickly or offer premature solutions. It requires patience with emotional ambiguity, tolerance for uncomfortable silences, and willingness to feel our own vulnerability as we open ourselves to another's emotional experience. All these capacities atrophy when we spend most of our time in digital environments that reward instant responses and superficial certainties. A particularly powerful strategy is what researchers call gradual expansion of the empathetic circle. Instead of trying to feel equally for all people suffering in the world, which inevitably leads to overload and anesthesia, we can consciously expand our empathetic capacity in concentric circles. We begin by strengthening our empathy with those closest: family, intimate friends, direct colleagues. When that foundation is solid, we gradually expand to include neighbors, local community members, and so on. This approach recognizes the natural limitations of our empathetic capacity while systematically working to expand it in a sustainable way. Another crucial aspect is developing what philosophers call cognitive empathy or empathetic understanding. Even when we can't emotionally feel for another person's experience, we can still strive to intellectually understand their perspective, their fears, their hopes, their limitations. This form of empathy is no less valuable than emotional empathy. In fact, it's often more useful for navigating deep differences and finding solutions to conflicts. Cognitive empathy also has the advantage of being less susceptible to emotional fatigue, allowing us to maintain our capacity to relate constructively with others even when we're emotionally exhausted. At the technological level, we urgently need to rethink how we design digital systems that increasingly mediate our social interactions. Current social media platforms have been optimized to maximize usage time and intense emotional engagement, not to promote mutual understanding or deep empathetic connection. We need alternatives that encourage paused reflection instead of instant reactions, that reward genuine attempts to understand different perspectives instead of confirming existing biases, that create spaces for nuanced conversations instead of polarized debates. This doesn't mean returning to more primitive technologies, but rather developing more sophisticated technologies that take into account the real needs of human nature, not just its exploitable vulnerabilities. We also need to recognize that the empathy crisis cannot be solved through individual choices alone. It's a systemic problem that requires structural changes in how we organize our societies. This includes educational systems that prioritize emotional and social development beyond academic and technical competence. It includes work environments that value empathetic collaboration and not just individual productivity. It includes public policies that recognize that social well-being depends on the quality of connections between people, not just abstract economic indicators. It includes media practices that prioritize nuanced understanding of complex issues instead of sensationalist simplification that appeals to the most primitive instincts. Perhaps most importantly, we need to cultivate a new cultural narrative about what it means to be human in an era of accelerated technological transformation. The dominant narrative currently suggests that successful adaptation to modernity requires becoming more efficient, faster, more capable of processing information in large volumes. But this narrative ignores the fact that some of the most valuable human capacities, including deep empathy, require slowness, patience, and sustained attention. We need a counter-narrative that celebrates these inefficient qualities as fundamental to our individual and collective well-being. The question is not whether we should embrace or reject modern technologies. They are here to stay and offer genuine benefits we don't want to lose. The question is how we can evolve alongside them in a way that preserves and strengthens the human capacities we value most. This requires wisdom that goes beyond technical intelligence. The wisdom to know when to use technology and when to abstain from it, when to seek efficiency and when to accept slowness, when to connect digitally and when to prioritize physical presence. It also requires humility to recognize that we don't fully know what the long-term consequences of the transformations we're experiencing will be. We are conducting a global experiment with human nature, and the results are not yet clear. What we do know is that some of the changes we are observing, including the erosion of empathy, represent genuine losses that we should try to minimize. Other changes may represent necessary adaptations to a new world we're still learning to navigate. The key is maintaining our capacity to discern between the two and acting consciously to promote the transformations we want while resisting those we don't want. The year 2026 doesn't have to be a point of no return. It can be instead a moment of awakening, when we collectively recognize what we've lost and consciously commit to recovering it. Empathy hasn't disappeared from human nature. It has simply been overloaded and misdirected by conditions for which we didn't evolve. With adequate understanding and deliberate effort, we can create conditions that allow our natural capacity for empathetic connection to flourish again. This will not be easy or quick, but it is possible. And considering the consequences of the alternative, it is essential the choice is before us. We can continue allowing our capacity to feel deeply for one another to be gradually eroded until we become emotional strangers in our own homes and communities. Or we can make the conscious decision to protect and cultivate this precious capacity, even if it requires swimming against the current of certain technological and cultural trends. Empathy is not just a nice virtue to have. It's a survival technology that our species developed over millennia. Losing it would mean losing something fundamental about what makes us human. If these reflections have touched on something you've been feeling, but perhaps couldn't clearly name, you're not alone in this concern. By subscribing to the channel, you'll join a growing community of people who recognize the importance of preserving our humanity amid the accelerated transformations of our time. Each week, we explore together the most urgent questions about the future of the human condition, always with the goal of developing practical wisdom to navigate a constantly changing world without losing sight of what matters most. This is a conversation we cannot have alone. It requires collective reflection and mutual support. Subscribe to continue this essential journey of understanding how to remain deeply human in an era that constantly invites us to become something different. The future of empathy, and perhaps of civilization itself, may depend on how we respond to this invitation.